start my talk today with a quote that I took from Elizabeth Gilbert's 2009 TED Talk. You may be familiar with her. She's the author of Eat, Pray, Love. And the quote that I'm taking is one from an encounter that she had with the famous American poet Ruth Stone. So I didn't want to fiddle with the internet trying to get the TED Talk itself to come up, so I just put the quote here and I'll just read it. What she says is, "I had this encounter recently where I met the extraordinary American poet Ruth Stone, who's now in her 90s, but she's since been a poet her entire life. And she told me that when she was growing up in rural Virginia, she would be out working in the fields, and she said she would feel and hear a poem coming at her from over the landscape. And she said it was like a thunderous train of air, and it would come barreling down at her over the landscape. And when she felt it coming, because it would shake the earth under her feet, she knew that she had only one thing to do at that point, and that was to, in her words, run like hell. And she would run like hell to the house, and she would be getting chased by this poem. And the whole deal was that she had to get to a piece of paper and a pencil fast enough so that when it thundered through her, she could collect it and grab it on the page. And other times, she wouldn't be fast enough. So she'd be running and running and running, and she wouldn't get to the house, and the poem would barrel through her, and she would miss it. And she said it would continue on across the landscape looking, as she put it, for another poet. And then there were these times. This is the piece I will never forget. She said that there were moments where she would almost miss it, right? So she's running to the house, and she's looking for the paper, and the poem passes through her. And she grabs a pencil just as it's going through her, and she said it was like she would reach out with her other hand and she would catch it. And she would catch the poem by its tail, she'd pull it backwards into her body as she was transcribing on the page. And in these instances, the poem would come up on the page perfect and intact, but backwards, from the last word to the first. And the reason I love this quote, and it has been sticking with me for a long time, is because it strikes me as an instance of what's called presque vu. So you all are probably familiar with the term deja vu, or you wouldn't have been intrigued enough to come to this talk. Presque vu is a variant of the deja vu experience that people may be less familiar with. It refers to a feeling of being on the verge of an epiphany, or a revelation, or some important, profound insight. And the quote by Ruth Stone really strikes me as this amazing example of experiencing presque vu. She can feel this poem she's on the verge of accessing this poem, this important creative output. It's right on the verge, and she needs to grab a pencil and get it. Well, I'm interested in studying presque vu. I've actually been interested in whether it's really a thing. Does it really happen? Do people really experience this? And if they do, does it really predict access to some insightful information, as seems to be the case with the poet Ruth Stone? And in thinking about this, it's important to consider that no new idea comes from out of nowhere, regardless of how creative or how seemingly novel an idea seems to be, whether it's a poem or some insightful breakthrough in science, whatever the creative idea is, it still comes from somewhere within the depths of our minds. And in this way, our mental leaps, even if they seem like they're gigantic when we make some kind of creative leap, it's still tethered to what we already know, what's already in our minds. I kind of drew this to illustrate this in some of my classes, that even the most gigantic mental leaps are tethered to what we know. And anytime we try to envision or imagine something, like the future, imagining what the future is like, we're still tethered to what we already know. And this is really apparent when you go back and look at the old 1960s Star Trek. Their futuristic imaginings of what technology would be like when we could travel in space. What do you notice when you look at the computer technologies in these photos? They look very 1960s, don't they? You know, you look at that old computer monitor. We would never even use that today, but that's how they were envisioning space travel, because they were tethered to what they already knew. They couldn't envision things like the types of touch screens that we have today or the iPhones that we have today. If we fast forward to a more recent futuristic movie. I don't know if you've ever seen the 2016 movie called Passengers, but in that movie, what's apparent if you look around this futuristic space travel movie, if you look at the screens in here, so this is in the cafeteria, how you get food to come out, you push these buttons, or in the movie theater on the spaceship, you can get your popcorn that way. What do you notice about these interfaces? They look just like our smartphones, right, and our iPads, right? So we're still tethered to what we know. It's very different from what we knew in the 1960s, but you can see how we're tethered to what we know whenever we try to make a leap and imagine something in the future or something that we don't yet know. Well, one thing that really helps humans make a gigantic leap in terms of creativity, moments of insight, is analogy. Often when we have an analogy, that serves as a bridge. It lets us get to a seemingly novel place from some place where we're already at in our minds. And this is actually a well-established phenomenon in the literature, in the study of creativity, in the study of problem solving, that what we call analogical reasoning plays a huge role in creative thought. And that's captured and summarized really well in this popular book called The Eureka Factor, Aha Moments, Creative Insight, and the Brain. You're probably all familiar with the story of Archimedes and how he was trying to determine the weight of the king's, or trying to determine if the king's crown was pure gold or if it had some other cheaper metal mixed in with it. And he's trying to figure this out, trying to figure it out. Kind of takes a break, gets in the bath. As he submerses into the bathtub, he notices the water rising, and that's when he has the aha. Supposedly screaming, "Eureka!" and running down the streets naked. "Eureka, I've got it." It's a classic sort of anecdotal example of analogy and its role in insight. When we make that connection, we seem to make this giant leap based in analogy. So speaking of analogy and insight and the role of analogical reasoning, I grabbed this picture off of Twitter, and Phil Donaldson probably recognizes this scene. I don't know where, you might be over here in the picture somewhere. But the organizer had taken this picture and posted it on Twitter. You can't really see me because I kind of blend in with the background, wearing dark. But that's me over there. This was a retreat, or a one-day kind of interesting, I guess, brainstorming session about a week ago at the Music District here in Fort Collins, where various people from the community were invited to participate. And the organizer from a place called Lateral Labs was involved in trying to get the groups to really creatively brainstorm and solve problems with gigantic leaps for the city of Fort Collins. So each table had a different assigned problem for the city that we each had to work on. But what was interesting was seeing analogical reasoning at work here. That they were basically giving us each analogies at each of our table to use to launch the problem-solving creative process. So that's me at this table. You can see we're all standing up like we're really into this too. And our analogy was from music, this idea that there's a hook in music at the start of a song to get people to want to continue listening to that song. And we had to take that analogy and some readings on that from music and then try to apply it to the city's problem of lack of resident engagement. So how could we take this problem from the music industry and apply it to the city to get people more engaged? And so that was our assignment. We were engaging in analogical reasoning here, and every table had a different analogy. So it's really neat to get to see this at work. In any case, and my clicker is so slow here, another example, this is two physicists who made a very important discovery years ago when one of the physicists, he worked in particle physics, and he had been working on trying to solve the problem of how particles, random particles, seem to pack the way they do into spaces. And one day, a student gave him a big vat of M&Ms just because he happened to like M&Ms. And as he's pouring M&Ms in and out of this vat, it occurs to him, he has this aha, eureka moment, that's it. It's the elliptical shape of the M&M. Look at how they're packing in there. It enables this unique way of packing into tight spaces. And so then he could go back and test that and got a lot of media attention for that. So back to Presque-Vu, I've been interested in, does this exist? There's a term for it, but no one had ever really tried to study it. And does it actually predict access to information that involves a mental leap? That has been a big interest to me in my research. And so given the known role of analogy in insight and aha moments and eureka moments, I wondered if we might be able to use analogy to try to study Presque-Vu in a laboratory setting. So we published this paper years ago out of my lab, my students and I, examining the role of analogy in reports of Presque-Vu. So what we did was we created all these analogical mappings, as we like to say. We gave people aphorisms that are kind of commonly known sayings or words of wisdom. Every cloud has a silver lining. Do not put all your eggs in one basket. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. Counting your chickens before they're hatched. Using an elephant gun to kill a fly. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. So people get a long list. We actually gave them like 100. So you're just getting a glimpse here. Then we gave them stories. And the stories that they were reading would each capture a particular saying within that story. And so for each story that people had to read, they had to first try to identify what's the famous aphorism that would correspond to this story, like don't put all your eggs in one basket, for example. And then if they couldn't get it, if they couldn't identify one, are you in a Presque-Vu state right now where we had defined it for them as this feeling of being on the verge of an insight or an epiphany? I asked them to rate how familiar the story was and then asked, well, do you know it now? And sometimes it would come to them, and that was the really interesting part. These are just examples of some of the stories. Gloria wanted a raise at work, but her company was not known for its generosity. She started mentioning the raise to her boss on a weekly basis and was soon awarded a raise because he got sick of hearing her complain. This one is the squeaky wheel, right. Ben grew up to be very similar to his father. They both watched action films and loved reading political magazines. He followed in his father's footsteps in other ways, too. They both worked as lawyers in the same firm. Right, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. So there's a couple examples. We actually gave them hundreds of these, so they would sit in the lab for like an hour going through these. But what was interesting about this work was that when people reported that they were feeling Presque-Vu, like they couldn't identify a saying, they didn't have a sense yet of what the meaning behind the story was, and I showed some really easy ones here. Some of them weren't as easy. When people felt like they were having Presque-Vu, like they're right on the verge of getting it, but they're not quite there yet, it did seem to indicate impending access. So what we found was that Presque-Vu reports were most likely when people failed to identify the aphorism on the first attempt. So they didn't tend to say they were having Presque-Vu if they got it, which makes sense, right? But success then happened on the second attempt. That's when Presque-Vu was most likely. If it failed on the first attempt, but then they got it on the second attempt, that was when it was most likely in this study. And the second interesting finding was that identification on the second attempt was more likely following Presque-Vu than a non-Presque-Vu report. So assuming that they didn't get it on the first attempt, they were more likely to get it if they said they were having Presque-Vu than if they didn't. And so it seemed to predict impending access to this analogical information in the mind. So I want to turn now to Deja Vu. Deja vu, you're all probably familiar with. In fact, how many of you have had deja vu? Almost everybody in the room. And that's pretty typical when I ask this question. Deja vu, if you're someone who doesn't have it, is an overwhelming sense of familiarity with something that should not be so familiar because it's actually new. One of my favorite examples to give is maybe you're at the Louvre in Paris for the very first time in your life, and you're overcome with this feeling of having been here before in this exact spot, even though that's impossible because this is your very first trip there. That's an example of deja vu. What I'm getting at, and why I started this talk with Presque-Vu and this feeling of being on the verge, like on the verge of an insight, on the verge of an epiphany, is that in recent years I've been starting to think about deja vu a little bit differently. So in the past, I tended to think of deja vu as just a feeling of pastness. And that's what the word implies. It literally means already seen. So deja vu, we tend to think of it as this alarming feeling of pastness in a situation in which we have no past that we can think of. I'm starting to see deja vu as a feeling of being on the verge, in the same way that having Presque-Vu is a feeling of being on the verge of something. And so the reason is deja vu has this very strange association with premonition. And by this I mean feeling as if you know exactly what's going to happen next. I won't ask for a show of hands regarding who's ever had this. People are often embarrassed to admit that they've had this feeling when they've had deja vu, but you'd be surprised how many people have this feeling of knowing what's going to happen next when they have deja vu. And if you don't believe there's this strange association, all you have to do is Google signs you're psychic. One of the first websites I turned up when I did this last night is this one called 10 Signs You Might Be Psychic, if that's something you believe in. The very first one, number 1 on the list, you experience deja vu a lot. Actually, if you experience deja vu a lot, it could be indicative of an underlying medical problem, and so you might want to consider seeing a neurologist. But this is one example, and other websites say things like top 10 signs you're a precog. Number 4 on this list is you have deja vu. Another website said 13 signs you may have psychic abilities. Number 2, you've experienced deja vu countless times. So all you have to do is Google signs that you're psychic, and you'll turn up these references to deja vu, because there's this link there, out there in the world and in people's minds. So is deja vu really on the verge, or an experience of being on the verge of identifying what happens next? I have many interesting stories in this regard of people who have approached me over the years to tell me about their experiences with deja vu. One happened to me. I was on my way, my watch was tapping me to check in for my flight to Tokyo the next day. I was getting ready to go on this big trip, and I was trying to pack up my office. And I have this rule, I'm not supposed to pick up my office phone if I don't recognize the number, but that day I picked it up, I don't know why. And I ended up on the phone for quite a while with this man who had called me from Alaska. And he was calling because he had this jarring, puzzling deja vu experience that was bothering him so much that he had Googled deja vu, and he was trying to figure out what it means and who knows something about it. And my name came up, so he was calling me hoping that I would have answers for him. And what bothered him the most about his experience that he could not get past was this feeling that he was predicting what was going to happen next, and that he actually did predict, and he was not a superstitious person, and that's what was bothering him so much. He said, I'm not superstitious, I don't believe in the supernatural, and so how's this possible? This really did happen to me. And so he was going on a hunting trip. It was the first time he was ever going on this kind of trip, and as he's boarding the plane, he realizes he's done all of this before. He knew exactly what was going to happen next. He knew what the person sitting next to him was going to look like, what they would be wearing. He knew exactly what the flight attendant was going to look like, and that she was about to come over and talk to him, and he knew what she was going to say, and then she did. And he just was so alarmed by all of it. That's one example, and this is someone not superstitious. Another, I have a colleague who's also a cognitive psychologist, and we're all kind of trained skeptics. And he told me years ago, when he started here at Colorado State as an assistant professor, he had this very strange deja vu experience where he was leaving the Clark building on the campus of Colorado State and heading across a parking lot. And all of a sudden, he was just overcome with this feeling that he was reliving something, that he'd done this before. And I said, well, yeah, you had. You walked across the parking lot every single day. He said, no. This was totally different. This was like every single aspect of the situation was identical to something I'd experienced before. The way the cars were lined up around me, the specific kinds of cars, the clothes I was wearing, the way that my bag was hanging, the way that the heat seemed to be emanating from the pavement that hot day. But the weirdest thing was, he said, I knew exactly what was going to happen next. This woman would be riding a bike in a no-bike zone, which is a dismount zone, and she'd be coming from my left, and she'd be wearing a white shirt, and just then, that's exactly what happened. And he has no explanation for this feeling of prediction and of having predicted after the fact. Another interesting story, a lot of you know just this past summer, I hosted a mini conference on the CSU campus on perceptual and cognitive illusions and quirks of our everyday experience. And in that conference, many of us presented on the topic of deja vu, and so it ended up leading to this big discussion among a bunch of skeptical scientists about deja vu. And people started to talk about their own personal experiences with deja vu and the sort of spookiness quality to it, wondering out loud if we could really ever capture that in a laboratory situation. And one scientist raised her hand and said, well, the most striking deja vu experience I ever personally had, and this is someone who's a skeptic and a memory researcher, I was in a town I'd never been in before, and I was at the gas station, and I look over and I see this car. It's like a pickup truck, and it has this boat that it had been pulling behind it, and I recognized that exact truck and that exact boat like I'd seen it before, but there was no way I could have. I'd never been in this town before. And she said, and I thought to myself, oh, there's a dog in that boat. And then just then, a dog peeked its head up out of the boat. This was just this summer story I heard. Perhaps one of the most interesting stories that I've gotten from people where you see this link between the experience of deja vu and the experience of premonition came from Elizabeth Loftus. How many of you have heard of Elizabeth Loftus in this room? I see some people raising their hand. When I talk to academic audiences, usually everybody has heard of Elizabeth Loftus, or people in psychology, everybody has heard of her. If you Google Elizabeth Loftus, she's a very, very famous memory researcher, famous for research on memory distortion and false memories. Some of you might recognize this background here as being the Laurie Student Center on the campus of the Colorado State University. Dr. Loftus had been invited to come give a talk on our campus, and it was to a big, full audience in our biggest auditorium on campus. But that's not the interesting part. So this stuff she talks about all the time. The interesting part was where we were talking kind of behind the scenes when she visited me in my office, and I mentioned some of my work on deja vu. And she said, oh, I have to tell you about this really interesting deja vu experience that I once had. She said, I was going to do a consultation. It was for work. She does all kinds of consultations. She does legal work on eyewitness testimony and how people's memories often can't be trusted. And it sounded like a business meeting. She was certain she'd never been to this house before in California. She'd never met this woman before who she was now going to meet at her house. And upon arriving at the house and entering, she was just overcome with this intense feeling that she'd been in that house before. And not only did she feel that she'd been in that house before, but she felt like she knew what was around the bend. There was an interior window in the kitchen, and she felt like she knew what was behind it. And this is a skeptic. If you ever look up her work, she's very, very skeptical of all kinds of things out there in the literature and in the world. And somehow, she's just perplexed. She can't figure out why this intense feeling. And as she's meeting with this woman and still trying to puzzle over this bizarre feeling, somehow the two of them figure out that years ago, she had actually been to that house. So years ago, a friend of hers who had just gotten divorced, was going to see the ex-husband at this wedding, really wanted someone to accompany her to this wedding. And so Elizabeth Loftus accompanied this friend to this wedding, and she was just there as a guest. She didn't have a friend. She didn't actually know the wedding party or anybody there, but she'd been there in that house. And so sure enough, the woman takes out her wedding album, and they're looking through it, and there she is in the pictures in the wedding album. And so we kind of have an explanation here in this particular situation. The link between premonition and deja vu also comes up a lot in survey research. So quote after quote, when you just ask people to describe their deja vu experiences in surveys, you often see premonition in their descriptions. And these are just some examples that were published in a book by Chris Moulin, 2018, that I've pulled from there. One person said, everything she said, I knew she was going to say, as part of their description of their deja vu experience. Another said, it almost feels like I'm having a premonition. And yet another said, it's like an old memory that I am in the middle of living out. Then there's this bizarre case. This is a study from 1959. Wilder Penfield was a really well-known neurologist, well-known for stimulating the brains of awake patients during brain surgery and having them report on their subjective experience during brain stimulation to get an idea of which areas of the brain seem to lead to which types of subjective conscious experiences. And he'd induced deja vu in this patient through stimulation of a portion of the medial temporal lobe region of the brain, which is kind of near the side of the head. Now you might be thinking to yourself, wow, they induced deja vu through stimulation, neural stimulation. And actually people do this now. There are many more publications. It's been done many times by neurosurgeons. So we know that this can be done. And incidentally, when I said if you have deja vu all the time, that might be indicative of a seizure problem or medical problem, part of the reason we know where to stimulate is based on people who have seizures originating from that area. Chronic deja vu is often a symptom. What's fascinating about this 1959 brain stimulation case report, though, is that the patient experienced not only deja vu upon stimulation there, but feelings of premonition. So this is a quote in this case study paper, just a tiny flash of familiarity, the patient said, and a feeling that I knew everything that was going to happen in the near future, as though I had been through all this before, and I thought I knew exactly what you were going to do next. So even here, we're seeing this association between the experience of deja vu and the feelings of knowing what is going to happen next. This is one of the first writings on deja vu to get at least marginally accepted in academic communities. It's a book published by NEP in 1983. And I say marginally accepted because it wasn't really. It's now cited in a review that is itself accepted in academic communities. Unfortunately, what was available about deja vu at the time this book was written in 1983, a lot of it was coming from the paranormal psychology literature and psychic journals and things. And so unfortunately, there's a lot of references to the term precognition. It comes up many, many times in this book. He was trying to collect everything that was known about deja vu that he could find out in the world, and there was no real science on deja vu at that point in time. So unfortunately, there are a lot of references to paranormal and this term precognition, which essentially means predicting the future. So he closes one section of this book with two scientific comments, close this subsection. Stenger and Konvorsky, 1952, on precognition, there's that term, again, explaining deja vu. So he was trying to dismiss the idea that deja vu is this notion of precognition or this psychic phenomenon. And these researchers had said no scientifically controlled evidence for the validity of such premonitions has been obtained. And he said, well, here's the logical sequel, West, 1962, which unfortunately is in this junk sort of paranormal outlet, wrote, an enterprising experimenter might try to induce the deja vu experience artificially under conditions in which the subject's ability to predict could be tested. So I just want to dwell on that quote for a moment here. An enterprising experimenter might try to induce the deja vu experience artificially under conditions in which the subject's ability to predict could be tested. Well, this is actually what we've done and do in my lab. And so it might seem like the work of science fiction, like somehow there's this deja vu generator, like from Back to the Future. You put something on your head and it just elicits this feeling. Well, it isn't random, but it sort of is a deja vu generator. One of my former students, who's now a professor himself, Dr. Ben Sawyer, he was my undergraduate here at CSU, which makes me feel pretty old. But he posted on Twitter at one point, Professor Cleary once asked me to help build a deja vu generator in VR. VR here refers to virtual reality. You say yes to a thing like that. He was really technically sophisticated, so he was a huge help at getting this clunky old 2008 virtual reality system to work. And so our deja vu generator was essentially this virtual reality system, which involved wearing a pair of goggles and being immersed in different environments in the context of what was essentially a memory experiment. And so it wasn't a random deja vu generator. It was actually based on theory regarding how memory works. So if you happened to be at Scott Denning's talk the other day, he talked a lot about theory and how if you just collect data without an overarching theory, you're really just stamp collecting. So we definitely had an overarching theory for driving our hypothesis about what should induce deja vu. So it's a theory of how memory works. And without diving in too deeply, there are actually math models. You can get really deep into the theory. Kind of a surface level description of the theoretical approach is this. We proposed that what may be particularly jarring or spooky about deja vu is the simultaneous feeling of intense familiarity with something while at the same time recognizing this is new. And that contrast, that conflict, is what's so bothersome to people about deja vu. That was our hypothesis, that you have to have this element of newness alongside the familiarity. If the familiarity is easy to just attribute to something, or it's obvious why it's familiar, that probably isn't going to lead to deja vu. It's when you have this juxtaposition, familiarity on the one hand, but newness on the other. And so the way that we created this in the lab was to have a new experience that's recognizably new within the context of the study, but that also has similarity to a prior experience. And what our hypothesis was that we knew from prior memory research that high similarity to something in memory, of a new situation to something in memory, does drive feelings of familiarity. And we do know that as you increase the level of similarity of a new situation to one in memory, you'll increase how familiar it seems. And there are math models that can describe this very well. Well, we hypothesized that if you're in a new situation and it drives you to consciously bring to mind the similar situation, you shouldn't really have deja vu, because now you know exactly why this seems familiar. It looks like this earlier scene. But if you fail to remember the highly similar scene, then maybe now you'll have deja vu, because now you're just having this sense of familiarity driven by that similarity, but you have no recollection to tell you why exactly you're having this feeling of familiarity, yet you recognize this as novel. And so it's when you have a failure to remember the highly similar memory that you're going to experience deja vu. And the more intense that feeling of familiarity in this type of situation, probably the more likely it is that you'll have deja vu in this situation where you have inexplicable familiarity juxtaposed with novelty. That's at the heart of what our hypothesis was. So this is what went into the design of our so-called deja vu generator. It was driven by this overarching theory of how memory works and how that might play into the deja vu experience. To create that juxtaposition of familiarity and novelty, what we did for our virtual reality scenes was we created identical spatial layouts across otherwise novel or distinct scenes. So you're looking at a bird's eye view here of an aquarium scene. This is the spatial layout for an aquarium from a bird's eye view. This is a doctor's office reception area that has an identical spatial layout, but it's an otherwise distinct scene. So it's otherwise novel within the context of the experiment. We created dozens of these types of spatially mapped scenes for use in this study. So here's a first-person perspective of the aquarium. It's coming up pretty dark, so it may be hard to see. And then it's spatially mapped reception area, an example of a bedroom, and its spatially mapped clothing store. Again, we had dozens and dozens of these scenes, and people would view, essentially it's like a list, kind of mapping from what people do in standard memory experiments. They view one scene after another, after another, after another in what we call an encoding phase. And then only much later do they receive these spatially mapped scenes that might potentially map onto one scene earlier on in the experiment. So here's an example of what we would call a test trial. The person's wearing these virtual reality goggles, and they're looking around as if inside the scene, and say it's the clothing store. Well, you might recall that the clothing store spatially mapped onto the bedroom. And maybe it was a while back now in the context of the experiment that they'd actually explored the bedroom. And so our interest was in when people don't recall. So they're navigating or they're exploring this clothing store scene and they can't recall the earlier bedroom scene. Are they going to be more likely to report deja vu in that situation when there is this spatial mapping than when it doesn't actually map onto anything from earlier? That was our hypothesis. And sure enough, that's what we found, that when people couldn't recall, so they don't really, once they can't recall, they don't have a basis for knowing which ones spatially resemble or not, other than their feeling. And in these situations, people were more likely to report having deja vu when there was that spatial mapping than when there was not. We also pushed around the probability of reporting deja vu by manipulating how similar the scenes were. And so spatial similarity is just one way in which a current situation can map onto something from the past. It's certainly not the only way and probably not the only contributor to deja vu. And so if you make things similar in multiple ways, so the elements themselves, for example, in addition to the spatial layout, then the probability of deja vu gets boosted even higher in these instances where people are failing to recall. They can't identify a specific source that's driving this feeling of strong familiarity. They're more likely to report deja vu when there's greater similarity. So we could systematically increase the probability of reporting deja vu by systematically manipulating the level of similarity in this situation of juxtaposed familiarity and novelty. So we have essentially a deja vu generator in the lab. So back to this quote, an enterprising experimenter might try to induce the deja vu experience artificially under conditions in which the subject's ability to predict could be tested. Well, could we now use this if we're artificially inducing deja vu? Could we use this to test if people can predict things? Well, in thinking about this, it's helpful to look at this quote that a participant had given in survey research. It's like an old memory that I'm in the middle of living out. We thought maybe what we need to do to test if deja vu is related to prediction is put people somehow in the middle of a memory as it's unfolding. If you think about it, most of our life events aren't static like in those earlier virtual reality experiments. People aren't just standing and exploring a room and then moving to another. Events are usually unfolding temporally over time. And so we wanted to try to create that and plot people somehow in the middle of a memory, so to speak, and see if they could predict what happens next. So to do that, we actually relied on our same scenes that we had created before for virtual reality, but to make them dynamic and unfolding, we created virtual tours instead of just plopping people in a room with virtual reality and letting them look around. So we created virtual tours that were just videos, where you have the first-person perspective, and you're sort of navigating across this scene in a series of twists and turns, like you're taking a tour that's being guided for you by this video. And so here's an example from a bird's eye view perspective of that aquarium scene. And here's maybe the navigational path that virtual tour might take. Notice that it ends in a leftward turn. Well, later on then in the experiment, what we wondered is, all right, if you're in the configurally mapped scene now, the one that might induce deja vu from that high similarity to an earlier scene, if that earlier scene can't be recalled, does that high similarity, high familiarity, we know that drives the feeling of deja vu, but would that feeling of deja vu then be linked to an ability to know what the next direction should be? We're sort of plopping people in the middle of a memory here, so to speak. They're taking the same navigational path through an identically configured scene now, and that should feel really familiar, but it's going to stop short of that final turn. And so our interest was in, could people then predict? This might get at how people might actually have prediction during deja vu and not understand why. It might just feel like you're psychic. Well, we replicated our deja vu findings that people are more likely to report experiencing deja vu when there is this similarity than when there isn't, if it's actually completely new within the context of the experiment. That we've replicated dozens of times at this point. We were disappointed to find no prediction. I actually thought it was this brilliant idea. We're going to be the first to show that there's actually a scientific explanation for being psychic and thinking you can predict something and not having any idea how or why you predicted it. But we found no ability to predict at all. When people couldn't recall that earlier scene, they had no ability to predict. They were exactly at chance. They could if they could recall it. So we separate that out. We're interested in when people fail to recall, when they have deja vu and they can't pinpoint the source. When people do recall it, then they can identify, but it's because they're consciously recollecting the earlier turn from the similar scene. When they can't recall it and they're having this deja vu, there's no ability to predict at all. And there's no association with deja vu either. So for a while, this study actually sat. I thought, oh, it's a huge failure. We're just going to let it sit. And I don't know why it didn't occur to us until a couple of years later from initially running this, that we hadn't actually asked people how they felt, if they felt like they could predict. We were looking for actual predictive ability, and then we were disappointed to have not found it. So a couple years later, we thought, oh yeah, we should run a different version where we add the question in there. Do you feel like you can predict? And what we found was that when people, even though they can't predict, when people are feeling like they're in that deja vu state, they are significantly more likely to feel like they know the direction of that next turn than when they're saying they're not having deja vu. And it's a pretty huge effect, highly replicable. We keep finding it over and over and over. When people think they're having deja vu, they also think they can predict the direction of the next turn, even though when we measure that, they're not predicting it. There seems to be this illusory feeling of premonition. They're not actually predicting, but they really feel like they can predict it. So if it's just illusory, why then do people feel spooked that they actually predicted something? If you think back to the stories that I told, right, in none of those did people conclude that they had not predicted. In fact, they felt after the fact, and they tell their stories as if they had, and it was so spooky because that should have been impossible, but they actually predicted it. So I've been pondering this for years because I get phone calls. I get a lot of media attention for this work because people are inherently interested in deja vu. And for years, people would complain, you're wrong, it isn't memory. It's not memory because it's a precognition. People call me up and tell me this or send me emails all the time. They have it wrong, it's not memory, it's about predicting the future. And when I published the illusory, the idea that the feelings of premonition are just illusory, I still got lots of pushback. Oh no, that's not explaining the times I actually got it right. And I've even had scientists come up to me after talks, and they sort of do it in a hushed tone, because scientists don't want to admit that they have these kinds of experiences, but they're puzzling nonetheless. And I've had some come up to me and say, well, how do you explain then when you really do predict? And some of you might be thinking that yourselves, but I really do predict. And it may be that sometimes, as in Elizabeth Loftus's case, there's an explanation for why someone might really be able to predict. But one of the hypotheses that we came up with is that maybe what's actually happening is our minds are tricking us. And this kind of fits the theme of this whole Summerfest, right? That our minds sometimes trick us into believing things that aren't the way they really happen. And so our hypothesis goes like this, that maybe experiencing high familiarity intensity while something's actually new, and you have that juxtaposition, extreme familiarity on the one hand, but newness, this is new, on the other, leads not only to deja vu, but to get back to this idea that deja vu might be a feeling of being on the verge, kind of like presque vu. With deja vu, maybe it feels like you're right on the verge of accessing how this whole situation is going to unfold. Because what deja vu feels like is that you're re-experiencing something that you've experienced before. So it may feel like you're right smack in the middle of a memory, like one of the participants quoted earlier. Maybe it really feels like as you're smack in the middle of this memory, you're right on the verge of retrieving how the whole thing's going to unfold. And so if deja vu is a feeling of being on the verge, it might be like a tip of the tongue experience, right? When a word's right there on the tip of your tongue, about to come to mind, it just hasn't yet, but any moment it's gonna. Maybe deja vu is similar. Maybe it feels like you're in the tip of an experience. This whole experience is about to come to mind, and you're about to be able to know exactly what's gonna happen next because you've already been through it before. And maybe that's what leads to this feeling of premonition, like, oh my gosh, I know what's gonna happen. I feel like I know what's gonna happen next. But in real life, what happens next happens right away, right? You have this feeling of premonition, but the situation keeps unfolding before your eyes. Well, chances are, if it felt intensely familiar early on as it was unfolding, it's still gonna feel intensely familiar as it continues to unfold in this striking sort of way. And maybe that high familiarity intensity, as it unfolds, it's so familiar that you think, oh wow, I knew exactly how that was going to unfold because it stayed so familiar. And maybe that just leads to a feeling of having known it all along. Maybe that high familiarity intensity is tricking our brains into feeling like confirming evidence, that we felt like we knew what was going to happen, then it was so familiar when it did, we feel like we knew that that was what was going to happen. And so to try to test this, we created a different version of our virtual tour study where we replicated what we'd found before. So people are navigating, now you're looking at it from the first person perspective. This is a greenhouse scene. They take a particular navigational path through the scene. It stops short of that final turn. And they're asked, are you experiencing deja vu? Do you feel like you know the direction of the next turn? And that's to replicate from prior studies the feeling of premonition before the turn. And in this study, we'd set it up so that there actually is no correct memory. We had set it up so that trying to predict would be essentially like trying to predict a coin flip by design, knowing that these feelings were illusory. So then what we did differently was we then let the video continue into the turn. And there was a 50-50 chance that it would go left or right. So unknown to the participant, it actually wasn't something that they could predict. It would be like trying to predict a coin flip. In this example, the turn goes to the left. So they'd stopped here, they'd been asked the first two questions, then after they answered them, it went to the left. And they were asked, did that unfold as you expected it to? And what we found that's so interesting is that when people thought they were having deja vu beforehand, so before the turn, they're saying they're having deja vu, then after it went into the turn, regardless of which direction, they felt like it unfolded the way they had expected it to, or they were more likely to feel that it had unfolded the way they'd expected it, compared to when they're saying that they didn't have deja vu. We also found this to be strongly related to the intensity level of the perceived familiarity of the scene. And so consistent with our hypothesis that it may be this intense familiarity that continues after the scene unfolds, driving this, that's what we seem to be finding. So we find that the intense familiarity beforehand, it remains about the same level afterward, the intensity of the familiarity, and it's strongly correlated with these feelings. We call it a feeling of post-diction, as opposed to a feeling of prediction. And so prediction is you think you know what's going to happen next beforehand. Post-diction is you think you knew it before it happened after the fact. And so it really is, it's a feeling of post-diction. So this is our theoretical framework that we're working with now, and we're continuing to test this in the lab right now directly, that extremely high familiarity intensity in a situation that's new. So you have that simultaneous feeling of newness, but intense familiarity can drive deja vu. It can, being in a deja vu state seems to lead to feeling on the tip of something, on the verge of something. It's on the verge of accessing how this whole thing is going to unfold, which in turn, as it does unfold and continue to feel that way, it feels like confirming evidence that you did predict, you knew it all along. So deja vu leads to illusory premonition, but it's still this feeling of being on the verge, I think. And that's how I'm currently thinking about the deja vu experience. And so we started a little late, but I think I can fit this into 1 hour. If some of you may have been at the performance a couple weeks ago called That Sounds Familiar. I don't know how many of you are familiar with piano puzzlers? So good, a good chunk of this audience, as you might expect. Have you ever listened to one and felt right on the verge of identifying what that song is? Yeah. That has been my experience as well. So I think this might be another example of feeling on the verge and having this sort of cognitive experience. And as it turns out, many writers over the years of deja vu have actually said that the term is not an accurate term because the deja vu means already seen, which implies that it's a uniquely visual experience, when it's probably not a uniquely visual experience. And Knapp, in that 1983 book, talks about this at length, that it's not just a feeling of having been someplace before or even of having seen something before. It can be an experience of having heard something before or having smelled something before or having done something before, engaged in some action before. And in fact, there are a whole list of terms, deja terms. There are also a lot of different vus, like you saw the presque vu earlier. But deja entendu is a feeling of having heard something before. It might all kind of be the same thing, just manifesting in different modalities. But recently, we decided to venture into the auditory realm. And one of the things that we really needed to do to study an auditory version of these type of phenomena is come up with a way to juxtapose, following our same logic, juxtapose familiarity, intense familiarity on the one hand, and novelty or newness on the other. We were trying to figure out how to do that with sound. And I mentioned this a couple weeks ago in That Sounds Familiar, that one of my colleagues kind of jokingly said, well, how would you do that? Maybe you could play Huey Lewis in the News, It's Hip to Be Square in the Gregorian chant, or something like that. But that kind of led it to hit me that the piano puzzlers are kind of doing that. They're taking known songs, but attaching them to a different genre in a way that makes them seem novel while at the same time seeming familiar. At least I often have that experience when I'm listening to them. And so we recently published this study, actually just about a month ago. It says December 2019, so it's not yet published. It's out there in a pre-publication. But music recognition without identification and its relation to déjà entendu, a study using piano puzzlers. And this was sort of a proof of concept that we could find analogous effects to other visual effects that we're finding when we use these piano puzzlers as our stimuli for this juxtaposition. So we've actually been studying in the auditory modality now with music, déjà entendu reports and their relation to prediction and feelings of prediction. And so perhaps not surprisingly, when people feel that they're in a déjà entendu state, by the way, we can push around déjà entendu with familiarity the same way we did with virtual reality, where you might recall the more similar we make a scene to something in memory that fails to be recalled, the more likely déjà vu. We've been showing that with songs also. So if we take the notes, and we do this more systematically, but if we take the notes from a song and attach them to an arbitrary rhythm, and we repeatedly play that throughout an experiment, say 3 times, we can boost the familiarity level for the song itself later. When people can't identify those songs as they're listening to them, the embedding of that tonal sequence leads to increased familiarity with the full song later. So we can push that. We can systematically increase the déjà entendu reports by systematically increasing the level of familiarity that people experience with the songs themselves. And what we're showing is that people also seem to have this increasing feeling of being able to predict what happens next in the song as you increase that familiarity with the song itself through this type of feature manipulation. And so people feel like they can predict whether the next note should go up or down. Now you might find that unsurprising because our knowledge of music might actually enable that. In fact, it does enable that. There is a lot of predictive ability that we have, which is why things like deceptive cadences work, right? We have expectations about where the note should go next. So what's really interesting is we created a situation that would be more like a coin flip, just to see if this could be illusory. And we had it randomly, 50-50 chance it would be the next note's going to come out of the left speaker or the right speaker. And the more people feel déjà entendu, or this feeling of familiarity with the song, which we can systematically push around through embedded familiarized features, the more they feel like they can predict which speaker the sound is going to come out of next, even though we designed it to be unpredictable. And so it seems that this sort of illusory sense of knowing what's going to happen next also extends to the auditory modality as well. And so I think déjà entendu is also this feeling of being on the verge. I think piano puzzlers elicit that really well, this feeling of, oh, I'm right on the verge. And a lot of times people do get it, right? And that's kind of why they're fun, too, is that you think, oh, am I going to get it this time? Sometimes you get it, sometimes you don't. So déjà vu and other strange memory experiences, I think I'll conclude by saying being on the verge. I think all of it might be an experience of feeling right on the verge of something, of accessing something, calling something to mind. So thank you.